Let's start by reframing what you think you're seeing, because most people get this completely wrong. When an avoidant shifts, when they suddenly become warmer, more open, more emotionally available, it feels unpredictable, almost like something broke in their behavior. You might even label it as inconsistency or emotional instability. But what you're actually witnessing is not weakness, it's not confusion. It's overload. An avoidant operates with a highly sensitive internal system designed to regulate emotional exposure. Their default setting is distance. Not because they don't feel, but because they feel deeply and have learned. Often early in life, that closeness comes at a cost. So they build structures, patterns of control, independence, detachment to keep that emotional intensity manageable. Now here's where it gets interesting. When they meet someone who bypasses those defenses, someone who feels safe, intriguing, or emotionally resonant, their system starts to experience something unfamiliar. Connection begins to rise beyond the level they're used to controlling. And for a moment, their usual coping mechanisms can't keep up. That's the glitch. It's not a calculated move. It's not a strategy. It's a moment where their internal wiring is flooded with more emotion than their protective patterns can suppress. And in that moment, something real slips through. They might open up unexpectedly. They might express care in a way that feels uncharacteristic. They might lean in instead of pulling away. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it, or worse, you'll misinterpret it. Because from the outside, it doesn't look polished. It doesn't come with clarity or consistency. It can feel confusing, even contradictory. One moment they're present, the next they're distant again, and most people react to that by labeling it as a red flag. But here's the deeper truth. Emotional breakthroughs and avoidance don't look stable at first. They look like disruption. You're not seeing a finished version of emotional availability. You're seeing the moment it's trying to emerge. And emergence is messy. It doesn't follow a straight line. It doesn't come with reassurance or certainty. It comes in flashes, brief windows where the person steps outside of their conditioning before retreating back into it. That retreat doesn't erase what happened. It proves how intense it was. Think about it like pressure building beneath the surface. When it finally breaks through, it doesn't do so smoothly. It creates a rupture. That rupture is the glitch. It's the system saying there's more here than I know how to handle. And this is where your perception becomes everything. If you interpret that moment as instability, you'll pull away right when something real is happening. But if you understand it as emotional overload, you start to see it differently. You recognize that what just happened required a level of vulnerability that goes against their entire internal structure. That's not small. That's massive. Because for an avoidant, showing emotion isn't natural. It's exposure. It's risk. It's stepping into a space where they don't feel in control. And control is what has kept them safe for most of their life. So when that control slips, even briefly, it tells you something very important. Their feelings have exceeded their fear, even if only for a moment. And moments like that are rare. They don't happen casually. They happen when something or someone matters enough to disrupt the system. The mistake most people make is expecting that moment to sustain itself immediately. It won't. The system will recalibrate. The walls will go back up, but that doesn't mean the feeling disappeared. It means the person is trying to regain equilibrium. So instead of reacting to the pullback, you need to understand the breakthrough. Because that glitch is not a flaw in their behavior. It's evidence of something breaking through their defenses for the first time. And if you can recognize that without panicking, without chasing, without withdrawing, you position yourself differently. You become someone who doesn't misread their most vulnerable moments, and that changes everything. Because in the world of an avoidant, the rarest thing isn't love. It's the moment they can't hide it. Now, once you begin to understand that what looks like a glitch is actually emotional overload, the next thing you have to confront is this. You cannot expect consistency from someone who is internally divided. That's where most people lose their footing. They interpret inconsistency as a lack of interest, when in reality, it's often evidence of a deeper internal conflict. Avoidants don't experience connection in a straight, predictable line. They don't move from interest to attachment to commitment in a smooth progression. What they experience instead is a push and pull between two powerful forces, one that draws them toward connection and another that pulls them back into safety. And here's the truth. Both forces are real. On one side, there is genuine emotional engagement. They feel the pull toward you. They think about you. They're curious about you. They feel moments of closeness that they can't easily dismiss. But on the other side, there is a deeply conditioned fear. Fear of losing autonomy, fear of being overwhelmed, fear of meeting someone in a way that makes them feel exposed. So what you see externally, this pattern of coming closer, then pulling away, is not random behavior. It's the visible expression of that internal battle. Connection versus self-protection, and the glitch we talked about earlier. That's the moment when connection briefly wins. But it doesn't win completely, not yet. Because right after that moment of closeness, the nervous system kicks in. It says, this is too much. This is unfamiliar. This is dangerous. And so the avoidant withdraws, not because their feelings disappeared, but because their fear intensified in response to those feelings. This is where most people misinterpret everything. They experience the closeness. They feel the shift, and then when the distance returns, they assume it was all an illusion. They tell themselves if they really cared, they wouldn't pull away. But that assumption is based on a model of love that doesn't apply here. Avoidants don't pull away because they feel nothing. They pull away because they feel too much and don't know how to sustain it. Let that sink in. The inconsistency you're reacting to is not the absence of emotion. It's the evidence of it clashing with fear. And if you can't recognize that, you'll respond in a way that escalates the cycle. You either chase harder, trying to recreate the moment of closeness, or you'll shut down and walk away, believing you've been misled. Both reactions, while understandable, miss the deeper dynamic at play. Because what's actually happening is a test, not in the manipulative sense, but in the psychological sense. The avoidant is unconsciously assessing. Can this connection exist without overwhelming me? Can I move toward this person without losing myself? And every time they move closer, they're taking a risk. Every time they pull back, they're trying to regulate that risk. So the question becomes, how do you respond to that rhythm? If you react emotionally to every shift, you become part of the instability. You reinforce the idea that closeness leads to chaos. But if you remain grounded, if you don't overinterpret the pullback or overinvest in the moment of closeness, you start to create something they've likely never experienced before. Stability in the presence of inconsistency. And that's powerful because over time, what begins to happen is subtle but transformative. The nervous system that once associated closeness with danger starts to recalibrate. The internal battle doesn't disappear overnight, but the intensity of the fear begins to decrease. And the moments where connection wins, they start to last a little longer. But that only happens if you don't misread the process. You're not dealing with someone who is unsure about you. You're dealing with Amon, who is overwhelmed by what they feel and is trying to manage it the only way they know how. So instead of asking, why are they so inconsistent? The better question is, what is this inconsistency revealing? Because when you look closely, it's revealing effort. It's revealing conflict. It's revealing that something inside them is trying to move toward you, even as another part resists it. And that's not something to dismiss lightly. Because real emotional change doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with conflict. And if you can hold your ground in the middle of that conflict without losing your clarity or your self-respect, you become more than just another experience in their life. You become the person who didn't run when it got complicated. Now, once you begin to see the pattern, this push and pull, this oscillation between closeness and distance, you have to ask a deeper question. Why you? Why does this dynamic even exist in the first place? Because avoidants don't do this with everyone. They don't open, close, retreat, and re-engage on that level with just anyone who comes into their life. And this is where most people underestimate their own significance. That shift you're witnessing, that moment where they soften, where they lean in, where something in them breaks their usual pattern. That doesn't happen randomly. It happens when you've crossed a very specific psychological threshold. You've moved from being someone who is easy to keep at a distance to someone who is emotionally significant. And that changes everything. Because an avoidant is comfortable with casual connection. They can navigate surface-level interactions with ease. There's no real threat there. No deep emotional investment, no sense of dependency, no fear of loss. It's controlled, it's safe. But the moment you become significant, the equation changes. Now there's something at stake. Now your presence begins to matter in a way that disrupts their internal balance. They start thinking about you when you're not around. They feel your absence. They notice shifts in your energy. And most importantly, they begin to experience something they can't fully control, attachment. And for an avoidant, attachment is not just a feeling, it's a risk. Because attachment implies the possibility of needing someone. It implies emotional exposure. It implies that another person now has the capacity to affect your internal state, and that is exactly what their entire system has been designed to avoid. So when you see that glitch, that unexpected openness, that moment of vulnerability, you're not just seeing a random emotional fluctuation, you're seeing the impact of significance. You become dangerously important. Not dangerous in a negative sense, but dangerous to their sense of control. Dangerous to the identity they've built around self-sufficiency and emotional independence. Because now, whether they like it or not, something in them is responding to you in a way that bypasses logic. And that creates tension. They want the connection, but they fear what it means. They feel drawn to you, but they don't fully trust the experience. They open up and then immediately question why they did. This is why their behavior can seem so contradictory. One moment, they're engaged, present, even emotionally expressive. The next, they're distant, quiet, or pulling back. And if you don't understand what's driving that shift, it's easy to take it personally. You start thinking, maybe I did something wrong, or maybe they're losing interest. But that interpretation misses the deeper reality. It's not about you doing something wrong. It's about you meaning something real. And real is what disrupts them, because significance creates emotional gravity. It pulls them in. It challenges their privichka of staying detached. And at the same time, it activates the very fears that tell them to step back and regain control. So what you're witnessing is not indifference. It's impact. You're seeing what happens when someone who is used to emotional distance begins to feel something that doesn't fit inside that distance anymore. And here's where your awareness becomes critical. If you misinterpret their fear as disinterest, you'll withdraw at the exact moment when the connection is becoming meaningful. If you chase their closeness, trying to lock it in or make it consistent, you'll amplify their sense of pressure and push them further away. But if you understand what's really happening, you respond differently. You don't overreact to the distance because you recognize it as part of their internal regulation. You don't cling to the closeness because you understand it's still stabilizing. Instead, you stay grounded. You stay steady. You allow the dynamic to unfold without trying to force it into something it's not ready to become yet. And in doing that, you create a new experience for them. One where significance doesn't automatically lead to overwhelm. One where connection doesn't immediately trigger loss of control. And over time, that changes how they relate to you and to themselves. Because the truth is, avoidants don't fear love. They fear what love will require of them. And when you become significant enough to challenge that fear, you're no longer just another person in their life. You're the moment they can no longer ignore what they feel. And that's not something to take lightly. Because being significant isn't about being chosen instantly. It's about being the one they can't easily walk away from, even when they try. Now, once you understand that you've become significant to them, that you've triggered something, the next mistake people make is expecting that significance to be expressed in obvious, conventional ways. They start looking for clear declarations, consistent affection, or predictable emotional behavior. And when they don't see it, they assume it isn't there. But with an avoidant, that assumption will blind you to the very thing you're trying to understand, because their vulnerability doesn't show up polished. It doesn't arrive as a perfectly worded confession or a steady stream of reassurance. It comes through in fragments, subtle, often unrefined behaviors that don't look like what most people have been conditioned to recognize as love. And if you're only looking for the obvious, you'll miss the real. An avoidant doesn't suddenly become expressive just because they feel something deeply. In fact, the deeper they feel, the more cautious they become. So instead of grand gestures, what you get are small deviations from their norm. And those deviations are everything. It might be the way they start reaching out a little more often, even if it's inconsistent. It might be how they linger in conversations instead of ending them quickly like they used to. It might be a moment where they share something personal, something they didn't have to share, something that exposes a piece of their inner world. To most people, these moments seem minor, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. But for an avoidant, they are not small. They are calculated risks against a lifetime of conditioning. You have to understand, this is someone whose default setting is emotional containment. They are used to filtering what they say, controlling how much they reveal, maintaining a level of distance that keeps them safe. So when that pattern shifts, even slightly, it means something internally has changed. And that change is not comfortable for them. That's why their vulnerability of ate. N feels awkward, incomplete, or even contradictory. They might open up and then immediately downplay it. They might show care and then create distance right after. They might give you a glimpse of something real and then act like it didn't happen. And this is where most people misread the situation. They interpret the lack of consistency as a lack of sincerity. They think if they really meant it, they would stand by it. They would stand by it. They would repeat it. They would make it clear. But that expectation is based on emotional fluency, something avoidants are still developing in real time. What you're witnessing is not a finished expression of love. It's the early stages of it trying to find form. And early stages are rarely elegant. They're hesitant, they're uneven. They're filled with moments of progress followed by moments of retreat. Not because the feeling isn't real, but because the person expressing it doesn't fully trust their own ability to sustain it. So instead of asking, why isn't this clearer? The better question is, what is different here from how they usually are? Because that's where the truth lives. If someone who typically avoids emotional depths starts sharing pieces of themselves, that matters. If someone who values distance begins creating moments of closeness, that matters. If someone who is guarded lets their guard down, even briefly, that matters. Not because it's perfect, but because it's intentional at a level they may not even fully understand yet. And your role in this is not to demand a more polished version of their vulnerability. Your role is to recognize it for what it is without overanalyzing or invalidating it. Because the moment you dismiss those subtle expressions, you send a message, whether you realize it or not, that what they offered wasn't enough. And for someone who already struggles to offer anything at all, that can reinforce the very walls you're hoping will come down. But when you acknowledge those moments internally, without pressuring them, without making it heavy, you create space for those behaviors to grow. You allow vulnerability to feel less threatening. And over time, what was once subtle begins to expand. What was once hesitant becomes more stable. But that evolution only happens if the early imperfect versions are not rejected. Because the truth is, avoidants don't lack depth. They lack safety in expressing it. And when you learn to see the meaning behind the subtle, you stop chasing dramatic proof and start recognizing real connection as it actually exists. Not loud, not obvious, but undeniable to those who are paying attention. And that's the shift when you stop looking for love in the way you expect it and start seeing it in the way it's actually being given. Now, here's where everything becomes decisive. Because up to this point, you can understand the glitch. You can recognize the inconsistency. You can even see the subtle signs of vulnerability. But none of that matters if your timing is off. And this is where most people unknowingly sabotage the connection. Because the exact moment an avoidant begins to open, when they soften, when they step outside their usual patterns, when they risk a level of closeness that feels unfamiliar, that is also the moment they are most psychologically exposed, not confident, not secure, exposed. And what they're exposing isn't just emotion, it's risk. Risk that they might lose control. Risk that they might need someone. Risk that they might feel something they can't easily shut down. So when that opening happens, even if it's brief, it's significant, but it's also fragile. Now imagine what happens if, in that exact moment, the other person pulls away. Not out of strategy, but out of misinterpretation. They see the inconsistency, they feel the uncertainty, and they decide to protect themselves by leaving. From their perspective, it makes sense. They think, this isn't stable, this isn't clear, I don't feel secure here. But from the avoidance internal world, something very different happens. Their deepest belief gets confirmed. See, this is why I don't open up. That's the narrative they've been carrying, often unconsciously, for years. The belief that closeness leads to loss, that vulnerability results in disconnection, that the moment they step outside their protective shell, something goes wrong. And when someone walks away right as they are beginning to open, it doesn't just end the connection. It reinforces the entire defensive system. It tells them, your instincts were right, stay guarded, stay in control, don't risk this again. And the next time they feel that same emotional pull, they'll shut it down even faster. Not because they didn't care, but because the cost of caring just got validated. This is why timing matters more than perfection. You don't need to respond flawlessly. You don't need to say the perfect thing or create the perfect dynamic. But if you misread that critical moment, if you interpret their vulnerability as instability and react by withdrawing, you close a door that may not open again in the same way. Now, this doesn't mean you tolerate unhealthy behavior or abandon your own standards. That's not what this is about. This is about understanding the difference between emotional unavailability and emotional fear in the process of being challenged. One is a lack of investment. The other is a struggle with expression. And if you can't tell the difference, you'll treat both the same and lose something that had real potential. Because here's the deeper truth. When an avoidant begins to open, they are watching just as much as you are. They may not say it, but they are observing how you respond. Not to their perfection, but to their imperfection. Do you become reactive? Do you demand clarity immediately? Do you pull away the moment things feel uncertain? Or do you stay grounded? Do you allow space without disappearing? Do you hold your position without chasing or collapsing? Because in that moment, your response becomes part of their emotional equation. If your presence feels like pressure or unpredictability, their system will default back to protection. But if your presence feels steady, even in the face of their inconsistency, you introduce something new, a different outcome. And that's what begins to shift their internal narrative. Not words, not promises, experience. The experience that closeness doesn't always lead to loss. That vulnerability doesn't automatically result in abandonment. That maybe, just maybe, it's safe to stay a little longer next time. But that shift only happens if the moment is met correctly. So when you see the glitch, when you feel that opening, don't rush to define it and don't rush to escape it. Understand what it represents, because you're not just responding to behavior. You're responding to a turning point in someone's emotional pattern. And how you respond in that moment doesn't just affect the connection. It determines whether they ever feel safe enough to open like that again. Now, after everything we've unpacked, the glitch, the inconsistency, the significance, the subtlety, and the critical timing, this is where it all comes together. Because understanding these dynamics is one thing, but embodying the right response, that's where the real work begins. And here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Staying in this dynamic in a healthy and effective way requires strength, not emotional dependency, not overinvestment, not the need to fix or save someone. It requires a level of grounded stability that most people haven't developed. Because when you're dealing with an avoidant, your greatest advantage is not what you say. It's how you regulate yourself. Think about it. You're facing someone who moves in patterns that can feel unpredictable. They lean in, then they pull back. They show you something real, then they retreat into distance. And if you're not anchored internally, that rhythm will pull you into reaction. You'll start chasing when they withdraw. You'll start clinging when they open. You'll lose your center trying to manage their movement. And the moment you lose your center, the dynamic collapses. Because now, instead of being a steady presence, you've become part of the emotional volatility they're already trying to protect themselves from. This is why strength, not neediness, is the defining factor. Strength is the ability to stay present without overreaching. It's the discipline to not interpret every pullback as rejection. It's the awareness to not overvalue every moment of closeness as a permanent shift. It's emotional control in the face of emotional ambiguity. And that's rare. Most people operate on reaction. They feel something and they immediately respond to it. They try to resolve uncertainty as quickly as possible. They want clarity, consistency, reassurance. And when they don't get it, they either push harder or walk away. But in this dynamic, that approach works against you. Because the avoidant doesn't need more pressure. They need less threat. They need an environment where closeness doesn't immediately come with expectations they feel unprepared to meet. They need space to move toward connection at a pace that doesn't overwhelm their system. And paradoxically, the more grounded you are, the safer that movement becomes. This doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect. It doesn't mean you abandon your boundaries or accept behavior that violates your self-worth. Strength includes clarity. It includes standards. It includes knowing when something is truly misaligned. But what it does mean is that you don't confuse their fear with your value. You don't internalize their inconsistency as a reflection of your worth. You don't try to earn stability by overgiving. You don't attempt to control the outcome by forcing progress. Instead, you hold your position. You remain emotionally available without being emotionally dependent. You allow connection without demanding immediate definition. You observe without overreacting. And most importantly, you maintain your identity regardless of how they show up. And here's what happens when you do that. You become predictable in the best possible way. Not boring, not passive, but stable. And stability is something an avoidant both fears and craves. They fear it because it challenges their privichka of emotional distance. But they crave it because it represents something they have rarely experienced, connection without chaos. So when you consistently, how grounded, when you don't chase their distance or cling to their closeness, you begin to shift the entire dynamic. Their system starts to recognize that this connection doesn't operate like the others, that it doesn't escalate it into pressure, that it doesn't collapse under uncertainty, and slowly their need to retreat begins to lessen. Not instantly, not perfectly, but progressively. Because now, the glitch doesn't feel like something they have to escape from. It starts to feel like something they can stay in a little longer each time. And that's how transformation happens. Not through force, not through persuasion, but through consistency of presence. You don't change them. You change the environment they experience when they're with you. And in that environment, something new becomes possible. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about decoding every move they make. It's about mastering how you respond to it. And if you can do that, if you can stay grounded when it would be easier to react, if you can remain steady when it would be easier to walk away impulsively, if you can hold your self-respect without closing your heart, then you become more than just another connection in their life. You become the experience that challenges everything they thought they knew about closeness. And that's the real power here. Because love doesn't grow where there is pressure. It grows where there is emotional safety. So the question is no longer will they change. The question is, can you stay grounded enough to give that change a chance to happen?